Welcome back to the deep dive. We take the sources you share and really try to unpack them, find the core ideas, the surprising bits, and what it all might mean.
Exactly. And today we're diving into material from Dmitry Gorbatenko's logbook.
Yeah, quite a mix here. We've got blog entries, articles.
Touching on some recurring themes, things like a privileged class,
Yeah.
Digital control, financial inequality, surveillance, that sort of thing.
Right. And our goal today is really to examine the perspective that runs through this material. We're focusing particularly on one piece called the privileged class, how the modern world was hijacked by untouchable elites.
Okay, so let's get into that core idea then. What really stands out, especially in that privileged class article, is this claim, this assertion that there's a group of people, the source calls them elites,
Okay.
who are essentially above the law.
Yeah.
Despite all the talk about equal rights and justice.
So the argument is they're untouched by the consequences, even for systems they might have had a hand in creating.
Precisely. The material sort of paints this picture where there's the ideal equal rights, law, justice for all. But then there's this other reality, an illusion, as the source calls it, for everyone else.
That's quite a starting point. How does the source say this actually works? How is the status maintained? What are the mechanisms?
Well, it points to specific things like embedded within legal systems and international rules. Diplomatic protections, for example. Sovereign immunity.
Hold on, sovereign immunity. For anyone listening who isn't deep in legal jargon, can you give us a quick idea of what that generally means?
Yeah, good point. Broadly, very broadly, sovereign immunity is this legal principle. It basically shields states, or sometimes their officials, from being sued or prosecuted in other countries' courts without agreeing to it first.
Okay.
The source suggests that while it has historical roots, it's now one of the ways this untouchable status is, well, achieved.
Got it. So it's things like that, plus maybe secret deals and what the source calls privilege-laden amendments. These are the tools.
That's the argument laid out here, yeah. That these aren't just dusty old concepts, but active tools used today to create this separation.
And the source uses a really concrete example, doesn't it? Something most people can relate to, international travel.
Absolutely. It sets up this contrast. On one hand, you have ordinary citizens facing, invasive checks, restrictions, surveillance just to cross a border. And on the other hand, it names specific groups. Diplomats, consular officials, holders of special passports.
And the claim is they just glide across borders without scrutiny. Is that the idea?
That's the phrase the source uses, to highlight the difference.
Yeah.
And a key point it makes is that this isn't just like a rare fluke. It's presented as systemic loopholes accepted without public debate or consent.
So according to this view, it's how these maybe technical-sounding legal details can actually create a really fundamental difference in how people experience something basic like freedom of movement.
Exactly. It's framed as baked into the system.
Okay, now, this viewpoint from the source, it gets even more, controversial when it talks about the COVID-19 pandemic.
It definitely does. The argument put forward is that the pandemic wasn't just a health crisis. It claims it was also used or became a tool of control.
A tool of control? How does the source say that happened?
Well, the claim is that declaring health emergencies gave governments a way, described as a perfect method, to bring in lockdowns, cancel protests, limit assembly, restrict movement, essentially to freeze dissent.
And there's a really stark contrast drawn here in the material, isn't there, between ordinary people's experience and the alleged elite?
Oh, absolutely. It claims that while most people were restricted, this elite group traveled freely, held private gatherings, and continued life untouched.
Wow. So the source explicitly says COVID restrictions were for the ruled, never the rulers.
That's the direct quote, yeah. It's really central to its argument about this two-tiered system.
The source also uses some pretty strong language about how dissidents were treated during that time.
It does. It claims they were smeared as threats to public health. It calls health passes digital handcuffs and quarantines house arrest. The argument presented is that the real goal was power, not just public safety. That's the interpretation in this material.
This really loops back to the source's bigger claim about this deep two-tiered reality, doesn't it? It's not just about travel or pandemics, but how laws themselves are applied.
That's right. The material argues these elites don't just create inhumane laws and gives examples like censorship, surveillance, economic controls, war policies.
Okay.
But then they manage to immunize themselves from their own rules.
And what tools does the source point to for that? How do they supposedly immunize themselves?
It mentions things like international agreements again, bilateral treaties, and what it calls protocols of convenience. These are presented as arrangements that effectively grant this untouchable status.
And the source is very blunt about it, saying they're not accountable, claiming they just don't face the same things ordinary people do: border checks, court summons, economic hardship.
Yeah, it keeps coming back to that backdoor idea, saying even during the strictest lockdowns or travel bans, there was always a way through for those with the right status, diplomatic, service passports, connections.
While everyone else, according to the source, was stuck in queues, isolation, and silence.
It's presented as a systemic bypass, yeah.
You know, there's an interesting development in the argument here. The source suggests these individuals, the ones using diplomatic immunity and so on, they're not just acting as representatives of their countries anymore.
Yes, that's a key point. The material posits, they've sort of evolved into something else, a transnational ruling class.
A transnational class, and their loyalty has shifted, according to this perspective.
That's a core claim here. The source argues their allegiance isn't primarily to their citizens anymore, or even to humanity broadly. It's to their own networks of power.
Okay, and how does the source claim these privileges are actually being used by this supposed transnational class? Is it for the greater good?
Well, the material argues quite the opposite. It suggests these privileges aren't used for global cooperation, but more for self-interest or network interest, shielding their assets, laundering their influence, and escaping scrutiny.
It even mentions ghost assets. What's that about? What does the source mean?
It seems to be talking about assets that are deliberately hidden or obscured, through complex legal setups, things like offshore accounts, dark money, shell companies. The argument is that these privileges help protect that kind of hidden wealth and influence.
That paints a pretty dark picture of the purpose behind the laws and systems created by this alleged class.
It really does. The source claims the laws they create do not aim to uplift or unite, but rather to maintain silence, division, and obedience. It goes on to characterize the whole global system they've supposedly engineered as one that rewards corruption, punishes dissent, and turns real people into disposable pawns.
Wow. The source really doesn't hold back in describing the nature of the system it sees.
No, it calls it a dystopia of surveillance, fear, and division. Straight up.
And it uses some very intense language, saying their world is no longer human, but more like a simulation of order crafted from corruption and delusion.
Yeah, and within that critique, it throws out these really pointed questions, almost like a challenge. Why do laws apply only to the weak? Why are those who make the rules never subjected to them? How long can a system survive when the people it governs are awake, angry, and unfree?
It's worth pausing here to note how this specific argument in the privilege class article seems to echo themes in the other source titles you shared with us. Things like the inequality of the modern financial system, the algorithmic shadow, biometric surveillance, digital dystopia.
Absolutely. You can see how this core critique of an untouchable elite becomes a kind of lens through which the source material views a whole range of issues in modern society and technology. It's a consistent thread.
And the source finishes this line of argument with a pretty dramatic final thought, doesn't it?
It does. It suggests a society built on this kind of hypocrisy cannot stand forever. It uses phrases like the masks are cracking and implies change is coming either peacefully or, well, as a storm.
It's definitely a challenging and provocative perspective presented in this material.
No doubt about it.
So let's try to pull this together. What does exploring this particular viewpoint, this specific interpretation from the sources, mean for you listening as you try to make sense of the world and the information you encounter?
Well, I think the important thing here is that this deep dive wasn't about saying this is true or this isn't true. It's about understanding one perspective that's out there, presented in material like this.
Right. A viewpoint that really pushes back against common assumptions about power, about how systems work, about whether the rules apply equally to everyone.
Exactly. And if your goal is to gain knowledge, to have those aha moments, then grappling with critiques like this, even if you don't agree with them, helps you see the bigger picture. It shows you alternative ways people are interpreting global events and structures based on the kind of material you shared.
It encourages maybe a more critical eye towards the systems we all navigate and the claims made about them, right?
It's about being aware of different arguments.
Okay, so that was our deep dive into the core arguments from Dmitry Gorbatenko's logbook sources. We focused on that perspective of an alleged unaccountable elite class. We looked at the mechanisms the source claims they use, legal loopholes wielding crises like COVID.
Right, and we examined the pretty stark view of the current system and its potential future laid out in the material.
And drawing from this source material, maybe here's a final thought for you to take away and consider. In a world that feels increasingly complex, shaped by technology, global systems, tons of information, how do you go about assessing claims about who really holds power? And how do you determine if the rules truly apply equally to everyone?
It's definitely something to think about, reflecting on the ideas presented in these sources.
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.